It's sad that I have to walk around, terrified for my life and my children's. I know if something happens to me, please know who did it. This man has said numerous times he's going to kill me. I am posting and trying to leave a paper trail. This man is extremely dangerous.
Morning calls for justice after a woman was shot and killed outside the Spalding County Courthouse. Krystal Evans and her ex-husband, Tom Mallory, were at the courthouse Friday afternoon for a hearing when Mallory allegedly shot Evans multiple times, killing her. He ran from police and eventually shot himself. Now we are learning more from Krystal's daughter, who says she had a restraining order against her father. Griffin Police confirms the couple had a history of domestic violence.
These weren't the words of someone being dramatic. These weren't empty threats posted in anger. These were the desperate pleas of Krystal Evans, a 44-year-old mother from Griffin, Georgia, who knew her life was in danger and was frantically trying to save herself through the very system that would ultimately fail her. Stay tuned as we reveal everything about this case. Drop a comment and let me know what you think about this story. Welcome to our channel. Please like this video, share and subscribe to this channel to help raise awareness and spread caution. Let's begin. On September 13th, 2024, just 2 days after finalizing her divorce and obtaining a permanent protective order against her ex-husband Tom Mallory, Krystal Evans was gunned down in her car outside the Spalding County Courthouse. The very place where she had sought legal protection became the site of her execution. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a sudden snap of anger. This was the culmination of documented threats, repeated warnings, and a system that ignored every red flag until it was too late. Have you ever felt like the system failed to protect someone you know? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This story will show you just how devastating those failures can be. What makes this case particularly devastating is that Krystal did everything right. She documented the threats. She called the authorities. She obtained legal protection. She even tried to create what she called a paper trail on social media, knowing that her words might be the only justice she'd ever receive. But protective orders are just pieces of paper, and pieces of paper can't stop bullets. Today, we're going to examine not just the tragic death of Krystal Evans, but the systematic failures that allowed a woman who saw her death coming to die exactly as she predicted. This is a story about a broken system, a grieving family's fight for justice, and the deadly consequences of not taking domestic violence seriously enough. Krystal Evans wasn't just another statistic. She was a mother, a businesswoman, and a fighter who refused to go quietly into the night. At 44 years old, she had built a life as a real estate entrepreneur in Griffin, Georgia, working hard to provide for her family and build a future free from the violence that had plagued her marriage. Those who knew Krystal describe her as someone who didn't back down from challenges. She was the type of person who, when faced with danger, didn't retreat. She fought back with documentation, legal action, and public appeals for help. This wasn't a woman who suffered in silence. Krystal's most vocal advocate would become her daughter, Precious, who watched her mother's desperate attempts to protect herself and her family. Precious saw firsthand how her mother tried to work within the system, following every recommended step for domestic violence victims. Get a protective order. Document everything. Call the authorities. Make it official. The divorce proceedings have been lengthy and contentious. Like many domestic violence situations, the legal separation didn't end the abuse. It escalated it. For abusers, divorce represents a loss of control, and that loss of control often triggers the most dangerous period for victims. Krystal had finally reached the finish line. On September 11th, 2024, her divorce was finalized. Along with that legal freedom came a permanent protective order against Tom Mallory. For many domestic violence survivors, this moment represents hope, the belief that the legal system will now step in and provide protection they've been seeking. But Krystal had been around long enough to know that paper protection was enough. That's why she continued to document, continued to warn, and continued to ask for help right up until the day she was killed. Her final days were spent not celebrating her freedom, but preparing for what she seemed to know was coming. She made those Facebook posts not because she was being dramatic, but because she was creating evidence. She was building a case that would outlive her. The protective order should have been the end of her story, the happy ending where the system works and the victim finds safety. Instead, It became just another document in a file that would be marked homicide less than 48 hours later. Tom Mallory wasn't a stranger who snapped. He was a husband who had been escalating his abuse for years, creating a pattern of behavior that should have been impossible to ignore. The signs were all there, documented and reported. Yet somehow the system continued to treat each incident in isolation rather than recognizing the deadly pattern that was forming. The stalking had become relentless. Krystal's family would later describe a man who couldn't accept that his marriage was over, who saw his ex-wife's independence as a personal attack that needed to be punished. This wasn't love. This was possession turned lethal. Domestic violence experts know that the most dangerous time for a victim is when they try to leave. Statistics show that a woman's risk of being killed by her abuser increases by 500% when she leaves a relationship. Krystal wasn't just leaving. She was fighting back to the legal system, which made her even more dangerous in her abuser's mind. The threats weren't subtle. According to Krystal's own posts, Mallory had told her numerous times that he was going to kill her. These weren't angry words shouted in the heat of an argument. They were repeated promises of violence that created a climate of terror in Krystal's daily life. But the system seemed to treat each threat as an isolated incident rather than part of an escalating pattern. Each call to police was handled as a separate event. Each report was filed without full consideration of the bigger picture that was forming. Krystal knew she was in danger. That's why she took to social media, creating public posts that served as both pleas for help and evidence of the threats she was receiving. She wrote about being terrified for my life and my children's, words that should have triggered immediate, comprehensive protection. The day before her death, Krystal called the sheriff's department to report that Mallory was stalking her. This wasn't a general complaint. This was a specific report of current, active danger. She was telling law enforcement that her stalker was actively pursuing her, and she was afraid. According to family members, a family friend had asked court personnel to escort Krystal to her car after her hearing. This was an unusual request. Many courthouses have protocols for high-risk domestic violence cases. But somehow, this request was either not communicated properly or was ignored entirely. The red flags weren't just present. They were waving frantically. A woman with a fresh protective order, reporting active stalking by a man who had repeatedly threatened to kill her, should have triggered every available protection protocol. Instead, Krystal walked out of that courthouse alone, directly into the path of the man who had been waiting to kill her. September 13th, 2024, started like any other day for Krystal Evans, but would end with gunshots echoing across the parking lot of the Spalding County Courthouse. The very building where she had sought legal protection would become the site of her execution. Krystal had business at the courthouse that morning. Court hearings were routine for her now, part of the process of untangling her life from her abuser and trying to build legal barriers between them. She likely felt some sense of security being at the courthouse, surrounded by law enforcement and court personnel. But Tom Mallory had been watching. He had been waiting, and he had been planning. While Krystal was inside the courthouse, Mallory positioned himself in the parking lot. He sat in his vehicle, waiting for the woman he had promised to kill to emerge from the building. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a calculated ambush. When Krystal left the courthouse and got into her car, she probably felt that familiar sense of relief that comes with completing another legal hurdle. She was moving forward with her life, building distance between herself and her abuser through the legal system. But protective orders don't work in parking lots. And Tom Mallory had no intention of respecting any court's decision about his access to his ex-wife. The attack was swift and brutal. Multiple gunshots rang out as Mallory opened fire on Krystal while she sat in her car. The woman who had begged for protection, who had documented threats, who had followed every legal avenue available to her, was murdered within sight of the courthouse that was supposed to keep her safe. Mallory didn't stay to face the consequences of his actions. Instead, he fled the scene, leaving Krystal die in her car while he attempted to escape the justice he had just made inevitable. But police were already responding. The shooting had happened right outside a courthouse, in full view of security cameras and within earshot of law enforcement. A chase ensued as officers pursued the man who had just committed murder in broad daylight. The chase didn't last long. Faced with capture and the consequences of his actions, Mallory made one final decision. He turned the gun on himself, shooting himself in the head in what appeared to be an attempt to avoid facing justice for his crimes. What state or country are you watching from? Does your area have better protections for domestic violence victims? Let us know in the comments. The irony was devastating. Krystal, who had done everything right, was dead. Mallory, who had planned and executed her murder, was alive and receiving medical care. The system that had failed to protect her was now working to save the life of her killer. The most controversial aspect of the case centered around the alleged request for a security escort. According to Krystal's family, a family friend had specifically asked court personnel to escort Krystal to her car after her hearing. This type of request isn't unusual. Many courthouses have protocols for high-risk domestic violence cases where victims need protection while transitioning from a secure courthouse environment to the vulnerability of the parking lot. But law enforcement officials disputed this account. The sheriff publicly denied that any such request had been made directly to deputies. This created a he-said-she-said situation that highlighted a fundamental problem. There was no clear protocol for handling such requests and no clear chain of responsibility for ensuring high-risk victims received the protection they needed. The sheriff's public statements about the case were particularly troubling to Krystal's family and advocates. Rather than acknowledging the system's failures, officials characterized the situation as a toxic relationship that was difficult to police. This language suggested that the violence was somehow mutual or that Krystal bore some responsibility for her own death. But the evidence told a different story.
Precious says her mother was at the Spalding County Courthouse for a hearing connected to their separation Friday afternoon.
The judge did issue a warrant. Instead of the judge taking him in right then and there, the judge said that he could turn himself in Monday night.
In a lengthy Facebook post, Sheriff Daryl Dix says Krystal walked out of the courthouse to her car where Mallory met her, shooting her multiple times from the window. Mallory did not stop for police and eventually shot himself. He's alive, but Evans is not, which Precious believes could have been prevented.
My mom literally called the sheriff department the day before because he was stalking her, and they did nothing. Had they had someone walked out with her, like, her friend asked, she would still be here.
Dix denies this. He says surveillance video shows Krystal never asked for an escort. His office also confirms there have been several domestic violence calls to the Mallory household. Dix says sometimes the violence was mutual and there were no witnesses to identify the aggressor. Dix says, quote, "Do improvements need to be made to the law? Yes, they do. Maybe it wasn't a deputy or my agency that failed. Maybe it was the law itself. And since she can't get her mom back, Precious will honor her life by fighting for justice with no sympathy for her father."
Not once did you offer your condolences, sympathy, or anything for my mom. That post was to clean his face, to clear his name.
Precious says she's going back to the courthouse to rally for justice Wednesday and plans to hold a vigil for her mother on Thursday.
Yeah, such a heartbreaking story there, Teresa. Thank you.
Krystal had created what she called a paper trail of Tom Mallory's threats and stalking behavior. She had documented everything, called authorities multiple times, and obtained legal protection. She had done everything domestic violence experts recommend for victims trying to escape dangerous relationships. The protective order itself became a symbol of the system's failures. While the legal document prohibited Mallory from contacting or approaching Krystal, it offered no practical protection. There was no monitoring system to ensure compliance, no immediate response protocol if the order was violated, and no security measures to protect Krystal during high-risk situations like court appearances. Security footage from the courthouse would later become a point of contention. Officials pointed to video evidence to support their version of events, but the footage couldn't answer the fundamental question. Why was a woman who had repeatedly warned that her ex-husband was going to kill her allowed to walk unprotected into a parking lot where he was waiting to do exactly that? The case highlighted broader systemic issues in how domestic violence cases are handled. Too often, law enforcement treats each incident as isolated rather than recognizing patterns of escalating abuse. Threats are minimized, stalking is downplayed, and victims are left to navigate dangerous situations without adequate protection. Krystal's case wasn't unique in its outcome, but it was unique in how well documented her attempts to seek help had been. Her social media posts, her calls to law enforcement, her legal actions, all of it created an undeniable record of a woman who saw her death coming and desperately tried to prevent it. The community response was swift and angry. Residents of Griffin, Georgia, and advocates nationwide recognized that Krystal's death represented a failure of the entire system designed to protect domestic violence victims. The very fact that she had been killed steps away from the courthouse where she had sought protection became a symbol of how broken that system had become. In the wake of her mother's murder, Precious Evans became something her mother had never been able to be, a voice that couldn't be silenced. Where Krystal had been dismissed, ignored, and failed by the system, Precious demanded accountability with a fury that comes from watching your mother predict her own death and being powerless to prevent it. Precious didn't just grieve, she organized. She turned her pain into action, becoming a vocal advocate for changes that might prevent other families from experiencing what hers had endured. Her mission was clear: ensure that her mother's death meant something, that the system would be forced to confront its failures and make meaningful changes. The rallies and vigils that followed Krystal's death weren't just memorial services. They were calls to action. Precious and other supporters demanded accountability from law enforcement and the judiciary. They wanted answers about how a woman who had done everything right could still end up dead in a courthouse parking lot. The community response was overwhelming. People who had never met Krystal Evans were moved by her story and horrified by the system's failures. They recognized that what happened to Krystal could happen to anyone trying to escape domestic violence. The courthouse steps where people sought justice became the site of protests demanding that justice actually be served. Precious fought law enforcement's version of events with the same determination her mother had shown in trying to protect herself. She challenged the sheriff's characterization of her mother's relationship as toxic, pointing out that this language blamed the victim for her own murder. She demanded transparency about what had happened and what could have been done differently. The media attention that followed helped amplify Precious's message. Local news outlets picked up the story, then national media followed. The case became a symbol of domestic violence prevention failures, with Krystal's own words serving as haunting testimony to the inadequacy of current protections. But Precious wasn't content with just telling her mother's story. She was demanding systemic change. She called for stricter enforcement of protective orders, mandatory security escorts for high-risk individuals, and real accountability for law enforcement's failures. These weren't abstract policy proposals. They were concrete steps that might have saved her mother's life. The fight for justice became about more than just Krystal's case. It became about every domestic violence victim who had been failed by the system, every woman who had been told that protective order would keep her safe, every family that had lost someone to preventable violence. Precious's advocacy helped keep the case in the public eye even as the initial shock wore off. She understood that lasting change requires sustained pressure, that the system won't reform itself without being forced to confront its failures repeatedly and publicly. The battle for truth became particularly important as different narratives emerged about what had happened. While law enforcement tried to minimize their role in the tragedy, Precious and her supporters presented evidence of the system's failures. They showed how Krystal had repeatedly asked for help and been ignored, how her warnings had been dismissed, and how she had died exactly as she predicted. The case gained national attention not just because of its tragic outcome, but because of how clearly it illustrated the gap between what domestic violence victims are told will protect them and what actually happens when they need that protection. Krystal's story became a rallying cry for advocates who have been fighting these battles for years. The death of Krystal Evans forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic violence protection in America. Her case strips away the comforting illusions we maintain about protective orders, law enforcement response, and the safety of our legal system. It shows us what happens when institutional failures meet deadly determination. The most devastating lesson from Krystal's story is that protective orders create a false sense of security. These legal documents are treated as solutions when they're actually just the beginning of what should be a comprehensive protection strategy. A piece of paper can't stop bullets, and a court order can't change the mind of someone determined to kill. Yet the system continues to treat protective orders as endpoints rather than starting points. Victims are told they've done everything they can, that they're now protected, when in reality, they may be more vulnerable than ever. The false security of legal protection can actually increase danger by making victims less vigilant about their safety. Krystal's case teaches us about the importance of recognizing patterns rather than treating incidents in isolation. Her ex-husband's behavior showed clear escalation. Threats became stalking, stalking became planning, and planning became murder. Each incident was documented, but the system failed to connect the dots and recognize the deadly pattern that was forming. The warning signs were all there: repeated threats to kill, stalking behavior, inability to accept the end of the relationship. These aren't just red flags. They're predictions of future violence that should trigger immediate, comprehensive intervention. Yet somehow, the system treated each incident as separate rather than part of an escalating campaign of terror. For domestic violence survivors watching this story, the message is both empowering and terrifying. Krystal did everything right, and she still died. But her death wasn't meaningless. It exposed systemic failures that can now be addressed. Her voice, preserved in social media posts and court records, continues to advocate for changes that might save other lives. The lesson for communities is that domestic violence protection can't be left to law enforcement alone. Friends, family, employers, and neighbors all have roles to play in creating networks of support for victims. The system failed Krystal, but individual people could have made different choices that might have changed the outcome. For law enforcement and court personnel, Krystal's case provides a roadmap of what not to do. Her repeated requests for help should have triggered escalating levels of protection. Her documented fears should have been taken seriously. Her death should have been prevented by the very system she trusted to protect her. The cost of inaction isn't just individual tragedy. It's the erosion of trust in the institutions that are supposed to keep us safe. When people see that doing everything right still results in death, they lose faith in the system's ability to protect them. This creates a cycle where victims stop reporting, stop seeking help, and face their abusers alone. Krystal's story demands that we do better. It requires us to move beyond treating domestic violence as a private matter between two people and recognize it as a public safety issue that requires coordinated, comprehensive response. It forces us to acknowledge that current protections are inadequate and that victims deserve better than false promises of security. The changes needed aren't mysterious or complex. High-risk domestic violence cases need security escorts. Protective orders need enforcement mechanisms. Threats need to be taken seriously. Patterns need to be recognized and addressed before they escalate to murder. Most importantly, victims need to be believed. Krystal told everyone exactly what was going to happen to her, and she was right. The next time someone makes similar warnings, the system needs to listen and act decisively to prevent another preventable tragedy. This story shows why we can't stay silent about domestic violence. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We need to keep telling these stories until real change happens. And if you know someone who might be in danger, don't wait for the system to act. Krystal Evans died because the system failed her, but her death doesn't have to be meaningless. If her story forces changes that save even one life, then her desperate attempts to create a paper trail will have served their purpose. She couldn't save herself, but her voice might still save others. The question isn't whether we can prevent all domestic violence deaths. It's whether we're willing to make the changes necessary to prevent the preventable ones. Krystal's case shows us exactly what those changes look like. Now we have to decide whether we're going to implement them or wait for the next tragedy to force our hand. Her daughter, Precious, continues to fight for justice, not just for her mother, but for every domestic violence victim who deserves better protection than a piece of paper and empty promises. That fight continues, and it needs all of us to succeed.